Kindly welcome everybody. Congratulations for the organizers for this fantastic event. And I have, to tell the truth, a very easy task because I have a very easy exercise to do here because we have fantastic speakers here from the global powers of our planet. We are from the UK, from the US, from India, from China, from Hungary. So it will be, I think, a very pleasant and very interesting conversation. And as far as I know the speakers here, I just have to start and then you will react and give your opinions and your thoughts. So thank you very much for this. The whole conversation, and it's very much also marked in the title, the geopolitical aspect of globalization. Mr. Mearsheimer, you argue that the globalization was a product of American unipolarity. Is that still true, you think, or does it changing time by time how things are developing in the world? What do you think about globalization nowadays?
I think the most important event in recent years was when we transitioned from unipolarity to multipolarity. I think when one wants to assess international relations, the first question you want to ask yourself is, what does the structure of the international system look like? I was born in 1947 during the Cold War, and we lived until 1989 in a bipolar world. There were two great powers on the planet, the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War ended, and then we moved into a unipolar world. And I would imagine most people in the audience came of age during the unipolar moment when there was only one great power in the system, and that was the United States of America. That world went away in roughly 2017, and we now live in a world where there are three great powers. The structure of the system has an enormous influence on how states interact with each other, and it has an enormous impact on globalization. During the Cold War, when I was young, there was really no globalization, in large part because there were two different worlds, the communist world and the Western world. And people in Hungary lived in a communist order or a Soviet-led order. Hungary belonged to the Warsaw Pact. It didn't belong to NATO. What then happened is the Cold War ended in 1989, and you had a unipole. And once you have a unipole, you get globalization, because the United States runs around the world running things. It creates a global economic order. It brings countries like Russia and Hungary, Russia for a while, Hungary up until this present day, into this globalized order. But what's happened is we've left unipolarity and we moved into multipolarity. And what you see happening is that globalization, that global order, that liberal international order that existed during unipolarity has fallen apart. And what you're getting is a new order. You're seeing a country like China trying to influence the order by building its own institutions, by shaping how states interact with each other through organizations like BRICS and the Belt and Road Initiative. So what I would say is that moving forward, you're not going to see anything like that globalization that you saw during the unipolar moment, in large part because the foundation has changed. We've gone from unipolarity to multipolarity.
Ms. Truss, how is it from a British perspective? Because if we look on historically, from the 19th century, basically, England was who created the beginning of this globalization. How do you see this from a British perspective?
Well, if you look at the history of the League of Nations, it's not dissimilar to what's been happening to the United Nations, that there was a grand vision of an organization that would secure peace through a rules-based order, and fundamentally it didn't work because ultimately it's nation states that have military power is nation states that have economic power, and ultimately is those nation states, when push comes to shove, that determine the course of world events. And I think we're seeing the increasing irrelevance of the post-45 institutions. The United Nations, the World Trade Organization, which was of course GATT, even things like the World Health Organization, those institutions are no longer securing peace and stability. And what I don't agree with the previous speaker about, I don't think it's inevitable we've moved into a multipolar world. What I think happened was the West actually enabled the rise of China by allowing China into the World Trade Organization, by allowing China essentially to flout the rules of trade and cheat the system. And what I think we're now seeing under President Trump is a pushback against the way that the system was undermined and sabotaged. And it wasn't just sabotaged by our adversaries like China or Iran, it was also sabotaged from within. So whether it was the woke movement, whether it was the environmental extremists who, have imposed massive costs on countries like Britain through net zero. If you look at Britain if you look at Europe versus the United States, we had almost caught up in terms of GDP per capita with the United States by the year 2000. We are now 50% worse off. And that is largely due to our energy policy, which has been terrible, our regulatory policy and our tax policy, and the massive size of European welfare states. So if you're looking at what is the cause of the decline of European power, the primary source is economic. And that has followed on to not enough investment in our defense capabilities, not enough technological competition. If you look at where all the big technology companies are coming from, very few of them are coming from Europe. And if they do come from Europe, ultimately they end up getting capital in the United States. So what we have seen over the last 25 years is a massive decline in relative European economic and security power. And frankly, Britain is a part of that decline. We started declining earlier. Between World War I and World War II, you could see a real decline in British power. And we have not regained that, but what I think is you've seen since the 1990s an increased acceleration as European countries have decided, with the possible exception of Eastern Europe, because they were under communism and understand why communism is a bad thing. But certainly if you look at Western Europe, you've seen high regulation, high welfare state, chasing after policies like net zero that have damaged our energy security and damaged our industry, and we are now in a much weaker position.
Eric, you were talking and advocating reglobalization. You were talking about previously. What would a Chinese-led globalized world look like?
I think the last round of globalization, which has been about 30 years, maybe 40 years, had, of course, generated tremendous amount of economic prosperity and wealth. And China certainly was one of the largest beneficiaries of this globalization. And so has the United States been. Both of our countries' GDP went up significantly. China went up a lot more because we began at a lower base. But the problem with globalization as it stands is, I think, it cannot go on for two reasons. One is, I think, within the United States and the West, somehow the economic benefits derived from globalization weren't distributed in a way that satisfied multiple segments of its population. So it's led to an internal revolt against globalization. So the architect of this first round of globalization is having internal resistance to it. So that's, of course, leading to deglobalization, because the leader of the globalization was saying, we don't want to do this anymore. And the second issue is, of course, the largest developing country that participated in globalization was China. And in the beginning, I think they had designed it in a way that the US and Western countries were at the core of globalization, and there were countries, developing countries, at the periphery. And the division of labor was clear. You know, the US and Western Europe were going to be in charge of R&D and finance and military, and we're going to do cheap labor and sell natural resources if we had them. China didn't have them, but others had them, and provide market. But of course, as China grew, it said, no, we didn't agree to that. We're going to move up the value chain. And unfortunately, the US and certain Western countries, they thought this, perceived that as a threat. So they didn't want to do that anymore. So I think we're in, globalization is in trouble. But let me also comment on the liberal international order. I'm not sure where that came from. Certainly when China signed up to the WTO, it wasn't told it was signing up to the liberal international order. It wasn't such thing. I mean, I think it was made up in retrospect. I think when President Jiang went to Washington, when China was trying to enter the WTO, President Bill Clinton didn't say, hey, President Jiang, you're signing up to the liberal international order. It didn't happen. So it was never there. So that's my 2 cents.
What is the India's perspective as really one of the largest powers which are developing in recent decades and standing somehow between the US and China in several regards?
Well, I think there are 2 things I want to be clear about. First of all, I will agree with my friend here, Eric, that the liberal order did benefit him, his country, China, more than India, but still India too benefited for it up to a point. But in some ways, it is not an undiluted thing to celebrate. I mean, there were many problems with it, and the underlying basis of it ultimately dissolved. The geopolitical economic order that it was based on ultimately was inevitably going to dissolve, because obviously the relative positions of the various countries was going to change over time. So I don't think we can go back to it. Whatever new thing emerges out of this, we'll have to take into account the new emerging dynamic, which will have to include India's rise as well. The second thing is that there is obviously an issue here that everybody gives their own point in history enormous amount of importance. But this is too not the end of history. History will continue to evolve, and many unintended consequences of some of the things we are witnessing now will also happen. So one of the things that we need to work out here is that this idea of that there was a liberal order, it was rules-based, and that everybody obeyed those rules and would or should obey those rules, that in itself should be contested, because in some ways this was just a power dynamic that evolved after the Second World War, and certainly after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990. History didn't end there. History will continue into this century, and many things will evolve out of that, and the way these rules are set need to reflect the reality of what happens today and into the future, rather than some idea that there was this good time. If you go through history, there have been many such good times of stability. If you take, for example, Europe of 1870 to 1913, it was also a period of stability of a sort. But then during that time, you saw the rise of Britain, the rise of Germany, replacing in some ways Britain as the industrial hub of Europe. You saw the rise of the United States, and of course it did end in 2 world wars. Hopefully we will not end in 2 world wars, but I am just pointing out to you that this churn happens all the time throughout history.
Gledden, how is it from a Central European, from a Hungarian perspective? Liz was already talking about this. Is Europe and the EU fit for such a competition?
Well, in the last few years, the European leaders have adopted probably one of the most aggressive versions of the liberal ideology which emerged after the end of the Cold War. And hearing some of the discussion thus far and reflecting on what Professor Mearsheimer said about having grown up in a bipolar world, I think one thing that happened during that period is that in the West, particularly in the United States, but also in Europe, there developed a particular way of understanding the Western success. If we wanted to explain this, we might ironically make an appeal to the old Marxist notion of the base and the superstructure. But during the Cold War, both sides put a huge amount of effort into articulating the intellectual superstructure, to articulating what it was that they were aiming at. So when suddenly the United States found itself as the victor, certainly in part through its strength, but also through a partial default by the other side, it looked around and the Western powers said, well, what is the reason that we won? And the answer that they gave was the superstructure. We won because this set of ideas and institutions is the natural triumphant ideology and the natural triumphant governing form. And there was very, very little questioning of that during the succeeding 30 years, particularly in Europe, which, as it was overcoming even a more complex set of historical problems than the United States was, it could claim an even greater triumph in unlocking this new stage of human history. So, of course, the United States already had merged its 50 states into one structure, overcoming the historical borders in Europe to allow free movement of peoples, ended up appealing to these very, very strong ideological categories. The problem now is that those categories and those ways of thinking are not proving very good guidelines for the current global competition. Even at the beginning of the Trump administration, I think in Secretary Rubio's very first interview, he pointed out that the world had indeed become multipolar, and he defined the direction of American policy as trying to find the best sources of strength and putting America in the best situation through which it could navigate the new global competition. That requires throwing out some of the old rules, throwing out some of the old institutions like USAID, reforming the decision-making processes, and all the things that we see going on over there. What we could say about Hungary is that it was early to this process, that due to its own historical circumstances, due to the nature of the events in the region, it realized at a very early stage that it had to find a new set of sources of strength and would not be able to navigate either Europe or the globe simply by accepting the latest version of the ideologies that were handed to it. So I think that there's a lot of similarity and certainly some disagreements in the comments that have been made thus far. But I think that when we talk about the situation of the new multipolar world, we're entering a period in which countries from the United States to European countries, Hungary certainly, are having to look back and figure out what their true sources of strength are, what their true situation is, because in that kind of new competition, the room for error is very, very narrow.
Tariffs, tariffs, tariffs. This is an expression that we heard. we heard very frequently. We have experienced a new wave of tariffs. It seems for me to be a new tool of sanctions. First, the US imposed them on steel and aluminium, citing national security. Meanwhile, the tariffs rates on China reached its highest in the last 100 years. And of course, China hasn't remained silent. How do you see this new tool Is it a realistic, a legitimate tool for realist taste and statecraft, or is it somehow a failed diplomacy? What is your perspective about the tariffs?
You're asking me?
As you wish, yeah, Liz, please.
As I said, I think the WTO had become a failed institution. Nothing was actually happening at the World Trade Organization. The rules were not being properly implemented. Countries who were violating were not being caught out. And I think COVID demonstrated to everybody just how opaque the world's supply chains have become and how insecure our reliance on basic materials like steel, critical minerals, medicine had become. So I think tariffs have been a response to that. They've also been a response to the fact, and this was referred to earlier, that the industrial base of many Western countries has been hollowed out, and those jobs have been exported overseas. And that's also partly due to energy policy, and it's due to the pursuit of net zero, but it is also due to the fact that it has become so cheap to import, and also we saw things like dumping of products on our market. So I think it's a very rational deal-making response in that countries like, or organizations like the European Union actually have very high tariffs on some products, for example, agricultural products. I think President Trump is entirely rational in taking them on in that respect, but also rebasing the global trade system is also right when you have an institution that simply isn't working anymore. And I support a system where there's much more bilateral deals between countries and multilateral deals, rather than having a one-size-all system that fits the globe, because I don't think it worked. I don't think it was enforceable. And the minute you have an institution that is not simply a collection of sovereign nations, and this is the problem with the United Nations, it's a problem with the World Trade Organization. There is no organization that can actually really enforce those decisions, and they have not worked over time. So I think getting back to a more realistic trading system that is based on agreements between countries is absolutely right.
Gentleman, John.
Eric made the point that both China and the United States got much richer during the unipolar moment when we had globalization. And he's, of course, correct. And the United States didn't care about that because the United States thought that once China got really rich and it got embedded in international institutions, it would become a responsible stakeholder, to use Robert Zellick's term, and then it would become a democracy, and once it was a democracy, we'd all live happily ever after. This would be the end of history. That was the basic idea. But it didn't turn out that way, because once China got really powerful economically, it translated that economic might into military might, and it began to throw its muscle around. And this, of course, scared the living bejesus out of the Americans, and the Americans have moved to counter China. We now care about relative gains. See, Eric was talking about absolute gains where we're both getting rich, and we didn't care about relative gains then. But now that China's a great power, we care about relative gains. So what we want to do is we want to maximize American growth, and we want to minimize Chinese growth. Anything we can do to slow down the Chinese economy and refurbish the American economy, we will do. And you see this reflected in the competition over cutting-edge technologies. We're extremely scared that China is going to beat us in terms of developing cutting-edge technologies. Now, where do tariffs come in? Tariffs are part of the story. What we're trying to do with tariffs is modernize, refurbish the American industrial base, make us much more competitive, and we're trying to weaken China at the same time. Because again, we care about relative power. And all of this is to say, that I agree with you, Liz, that we made a fundamental mistake in the 1990s and in the first 20 years of the 21st century in helping China to become Godzilla. It's come back to haunt us, and we're now trying to rectify that. And again, tariffs are part of that story.
Let me comment on that.
Let Eric comment on this.
I think well, of course, like I said, both countries benefit tremendously. But if the United States, certainly the U.S. did not set up the system and ask China to join out of charity. I really don't think so. They thought that they would benefit too. That's number one. Number two, if the U.S. thought that if China develops and eventually it will become a liberal country, they never told us that. Nobody told us that. It was a secret intent. It wasn't disclosed in the prospectus. Okay, we signed up to WTO, and there was a prospectus, there were a bunch of rules, a lot of text, a lot of words, nothing in it that said, hey, if your economy develops, you must become a liberal society. It wasn't there. We didn't sign up to that, like I said. So I think, well, look, if the U.S. is now changing its path, changing its direction, that's completely within its power to do. It's a sovereign nation. Tariffs and all of that, if the globalization, if the United States wants to ditch globalization for its own needs, I think China will adapt. Everybody has to adapt. It's okay. I think China will do okay in this new era, and it will adapt.
Probably let them first and then Senor.
These comments are really, really interesting, and having spent a little bit of time in American academia in political science departments, I can assure you that in political science departments, the only thing that they have been certain about for the last 30 years is that economic liberalization will lead to political liberalization as well, and the only it's almost like a form of Gnostic wisdom, that liberal democracies don't go to war against one another, and this is the only thing that we know. But yes, I guess it wasn't communicated, but they all believed it. But I was thinking about a cover story on the Wall Street Journal at some point about 2 years ago, after the Russia-Ukraine conflict had been going on for a while, and it was a picture of a black powder ammunition factory in Louisiana that had exploded. And this was not a really high-tech looking factory. It was like a hut on the side of the road. And there was a fire or something, and it was damaged. And the point of the story was, this is the only black powder ammunition manufacturing plant in the United States, and it's literally a hut on the side of the road in Louisiana, and a little bit of black powder ammunition is needed in pretty much every element of ammunition manufacturing. This was the bottleneck. You think of bottlenecks as being there's probably some complicated factory. The bottleneck was this little place in Louisiana. And I think the war, particularly from the side of American supply of material, put this back on the map. The problem is that American political institutions have not been designed, at least in recent years, for launching huge industrial policies or even taking major strategic manufacturing goals into consideration. The Republican Party before Trump was resolutely against anything like that. The financial system, which was the marquee service that the US was offering during the heyday of globalization, was literally designed to empty the United States of those types of factories. So the situation on the day before the Liberation Day tariffs is that if you're Trump, looking at the landscape of American politics and saying, how do we put strategic industrial concerns back on the agenda in a way that everyone has to talk about them, everyone has to take them into consideration. What are my options? Okay, well, the next congressional elections are already in a year and a half, and so nothing is going to happen there. There aren't many options except for using executive authority, which he's done much more in the first few months than he did in his previous term. And by imposing the tariffs, well, will tariffs on black powder ammunition manufacturing immediately bring all black powder ammunition plants to the US? I know that it's more complicated than that, but he managed to put balanced trade on the agenda. He managed to put the strategic question on the agenda about those areas, and probably other things will follow. Maybe it will go into legislation later. Maybe entrepreneurs will consider these things. It changed the nature of the global competition. Doesn't change America's industrial power overnight. America won't suddenly be able to compete with China in shipbuilding manufacturing, which is totally dominated by China. But at least they have a shipping revitalization plan, which the previous Trump administration was not so effective in these areas. And it seems like it's coming really from within. A lot of people in the country are recognizing it. The way that the politics is structured is an obstacle, but I think that the tariffs managed to put back on this question of industrial strategy.
Sanjeev?
As the citizen of a country that is now emerging as a third pole, but still a long way to go. My real interest is not how we got here, but what is going to happen going forward. Because I have to try and maximize the next 25 years of demographic sweet spot in trying to kind of improve the quality of the lives of a very poor country, what is still a very poor country. So my real issue here is the following. What happens from here and what do we do about it? So, at the risk of attempting to guess where all of this is going, I think what we will end up with is a network of bilateral deals with two big centers of gravity. One will be the US and the other will be China. Now this network will not break up into two blocks as many people think. My sense is that there will be enough trade between these two blocks, but there will be these two rival centers of gravity. And while one doesn't have to choose in a clear way as you had to in the Cold War, you will have to kind of side in one way or the other with one or the other center of gravity. Now, as things are emerging, say India is already signed a free trade agreement with Australia, the UK, and is in advanced discussions with the European Union and the US. I can foresee that we will probably end up in that side of the network dominated by the West. That doesn't mean we will not trade with China. We still will trade with China. China is our biggest trading partner on goods, and the US is our biggest trading partner on services. But I can see that is a world in which we would end up drifting in that direction just because of the logic of how the geopolitics or the way the free trade agreements would work. And incidentally, we have explicitly kept out of RCEP. So at least in the case of India, that is how we think we will navigate this.
I think let's continue this because it's a very interesting topic that you started to talk about. The main question that appears to me after this round, who can win this trade war? What happens with this trade war? Is it going on or it will be balanced out? What are your bets and why? John.
Yeah, if I can just say a word, picking up on what you said. I think the way to think about the world we're moving into is to separate the economic from the security competition and think about it in the context of the pre-World War I period, not the Cold War. Now you're probably saying to yourself, what is he talking about? Before World War I, here in Europe, there was a huge amount of economic intercourse among all of the states. There was a huge amount of economic interdependence here in Europe. Nevertheless, at the same time, you had two powerful security blocs. One was the Triple Entente, which was France, Britain, and Russia, and the other was the Triple Alliance. Germany, of course, was the key player, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. And you had this intense security competition before World War I that, of course, in August 1914, led to World War I. But at the same time you had this intense security competition, you had all this economic interdependence. Fast forward to the Cold War, when I grew up, there was hardly any economic intercourse between the West and the East. So there was security competition, but no economic intercourse. The situation moving forward is going to look like the pre-World War I period. It's not going to look like the Cold War. There's going to be a great deal of economic intercourse between India and China, the United States and China, Europe and China. The key issue inside the economic realm will have to do with high-edge or cutting-edge technologies. That's what the United States really cares about in terms of the competition with China. And just to take Europe and how this competition will affect Europe, there's no question, given the economic state of Europe, that European states will have a powerful incentive to want to trade with China. And the United States will tolerate that as long as Europeans don't trade cutting-edge technologies to the Chinese. Because what the Americans are trying to do, as Eric knows very well, is the Americans are trying to throttle, slow down China's development of cutting-edge technologies. And the United States is not going to be happy if Europe trades cutting-edge technologies or technologies that feed into cutting-edge technologies with China. But nevertheless, Europeans, Americans, Indians, we're going to trade with the Chinese. But at the same time, you're going to have a wicked and very dangerous security competition in East Asia for many, many years moving forward.
Eric?
I think if the United States wants to contain China through technological means, which is understandable, then I think they're pursuing very mistaken tactics. I don't understand why. By cutting off semiconductor, for instance, when Mr. Biden did, and the Chinese were asleep at the wheel for a long time on the stuff. They woke up the Chinese and said, whoa, this is what they could do to us. And listen, we graduate more STEM students than the rest of the world combined. Okay, and we got research dollars more than the rest of the world combined. If you don't think we can lick semiconductor, you gotta be out to lunch. So I just don't think that's the productive way to go about it. By the way, I totally understand. I think the Chinese understand the U.S. wants to reindustrialize. If I were running the United States, I would want to reindustrialize too. I just wish there could be a friendlier way to go about it externally. And I actually think, that's why I'm actually reasonably optimistic. I actually think the Chinese would be willing to cooperate and maybe contribute to that effort. Certainly China is the largest industrial power in the world. There's some kind of accommodation that could be reached, I believe, if we pursue a friendlier atmosphere.
How should we decode this? Is it a positive or a negative answer to my question of the trade war? How should we decode it? Is it a positive or a negative answer that the trade war can end soon? Or how do you see this, Liz?
I very much agree with this. We're going to end up with two competing networks. And in fact, I think that's what's already been happening. We haven't talked about the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and Africa, but what has happened is the United States, for the last 25 years, haven't really been playing on that economic pitch. They haven't been signing new trade deals. They've been allowing China to use the Belt and Road Initiative, use trade to pull more countries into their orbit. And we're seeing what we're seeing with the trade war, which is also offers of trade deals as well. So, people lining up at the White House to sign new deals with the president, is the US re-engaging in that economic battle that it had pretty much left the pitch on, particularly during the Biden presidency. Ultimately, and this is where I slightly disagree with the sort of the term multipolar, the US is still the most powerful country in the world. And ultimately, I don't think it has been using its leverage for the last 25 years. And that is what President Trump is fundamentally doing. He's saying, I'm going to use the leverage of the US consumer market to get what I want with respect to Europe. So Europe has all kinds of non-trade barriers up against US products. Those can be removed under economic pressure. America can also put pressure on Europe as to what we do with China, and what our economic relationship is with China, and which goods we can or which services can be traded with China. So there is a big opportunity for the US to use its leverage at present. I think within a decade or so, China would have gained sufficiently that would no longer be possible, which is why I think now is exactly the right time to act. And of course, China isn't going to like that.
I think that we have a lot of time to unpack it over the next couple of days, but I'm trying not to use a Latin expression from my old study of scholastic philosophy, but the word multipolar is said in many ways, and I think when U.S. decision makers refer to it, they mean something like what Liz is saying, and when it's used at the BRICS Council, it means something different. So there are those who use the word multipolar to say, well, thank God that we've moved away from the era of Western hegemony, and it'll be much better for world peace, et cetera, if there's a different set of world powers. And I think when Secretary Rubio, again, just trying to interpret when U.S. decision makers have referred to this recently, I think that they're speaking more in the manner that Liz is suggesting, that the situation of the world now resulted in part from catastrophic decisions by Western leaders, and using the window of opportunity that is available to them and the options that are available, policy levers and options that are available to them, they will try to situate America and the West to compete better, or to realize, as you say, what the different levers of influence are and what the different planes of competition are. So everyone made fun of Trump when he declared that it's now the Gulf of America, and started talking about the Panama Canal and Canada and Greenland. But if objectively things are in a more multipolar situation, for better or worse, one of the things that you naturally can focus on is your region. You have a better knowledge there. There's even a historical doctrine in the U.S. context, the Monroe Doctrine, which has oriented American policy toward attending to the nature of its own region, and probably you're going to be better at figuring out how to navigate that than doing something very far-flung. And Trump, by picking this term Gulf of America, again, people thought it was ridiculous, but it's precisely that kind of meme generation capacity that he has, that puts a word out there and then suddenly everyone's talking about it, and actually it ends up as memes do. Glad we've gotten to the serious part of the discussion, but as memes do, ends up shaping the way that people think. The problem, or a big problem within the U.S. from this standpoint, though, is that there's a huge amount of path dependency around being a primarily consumer-oriented economy, and there's even the status of the U.S. dollar as a global reserve currency has been the hinge on which that rests. So I think that there is some truth also to what Eric says, that the policy levers that the West was able to use in the 1990s, successfully defending itself by imposing sanctions on particular industries or on particular types of exports, was effective in many ways, but the results of those actions are less effective today. One of the things that has been weaponized in the last few years through the sanctions imposed on Russia in the SWIFT system was the reserve currency status itself. And it will be a quite complex political problem, although a very important one. I mean, it is, in a way, the problem that the US needs to solve in order to compete well in upcoming years. But the problem that it will have to solve is how to maneuver itself, hold together as a country, and shift toward a more industrial economy. That means it's less based on freewheeling acquisition of debts or debt-driven consumer society, moving away from that and managing the political results of that and increasing investment. That's a quite complicated process, and somehow putting a few markers down like Gulf of America or looking in the region is something that I think will help that along.
Sanjeev and then John, and then we move to the next topic.
So I think one issue is that the personal style of President Trump very often distracts from the wider issue that there needed to be some radical change that had to happen in the US's approach to the world. And take, for example, the shutting down of US aid. When it was done, there were sort of those of a liberal bent were of the opinion that recipient countries would be very unhappy about this. But in fact, most recipient countries, like India, were rather pleased about the fact that the US aid was shut down, because it's mostly used for interfering and doing regime change and those kinds of things in these recipient countries. So, those tools had run their course. Maybe they used to be useful at one point in time. I don't think so. But anyway, maybe they did. But that cycle had ended. Similarly, these international institutions like WHO and so on clearly didn't function during the one point in history it needed to have, which was the COVID crisis. So I think there was a case for radical reorientation. Whether or not the way President Trump is going about it, we can debate. But I can see that this turbulence that we are seeing in terms of the world order, the old world order dissolving, is something I think was inevitable. And it was inevitable consequently that the old power, so to speak, was going to change its approach in many ways. But one has to also take into account that it's a game in which other players will also play their moves. And so yes, if you deny China certain technologies, it's not unreasonable that it too will develop some of those technologies. Now, as an emerging third pole, and we have some way to go, we have to navigate between all of these things. So I think the most important thing for a country like India and others as well, like Europe and so on, will be the extent to which we can pursue longer-term objectives while retaining as much flexibility and optionality as possible.
John?
I'll just say 1 minute worth of comments, and then you can go to the next issue. I just want to make it clear that I was not arguing that the United States will defeat the Chinese in this economic race or in this arms race. The Chinese are incredibly impressive, and there are all sorts of reasons to think that the United States is in deep trouble and not up for arms racing, either economically or militarily, with the Chinese.
My last topic is Europe and the circumstances where the European Union is. And I would add to this topic your opinion about the Ukrainian-Russian war. If you look on the history of Europe, within Europe it was always a big question, where belongs Russia? Is it part of Europe? Is it part of Asia? We know this old plan of Prussia and Germany to connect the Russian energy and minerals with the German Central European economy. Of course, we know the plans of the UK and France somehow to disconnect this. How does it look like for the future? How does this whole game and this whole thing, what is going on between the West and the East, between Russia and Europe and the Western world, what kind of role will it play for the whole question that we have as a title here? What is your opinion about this? And especially in our region, we are next to Ukraine. It's a big question and a big fear in our society. Will this war end soon? How will it end? And because it's a big interest that we stop dying, that people are dying next to in our neighborhood. And the other hand, economically, it would be also very, very important for this region that the circumstances are getting clear, and especially if you look on the energy security of Hungary and the region and the economic development, it is a key issue how this war ends and as soon as possible ends. What is your opinion and your country's opinion about this? Please.
So on the subject of the European Union, of course, Britain left the European Union. Unfortunately, we've kept all of the same mentality, all of the same bureaucracy, all of the same laws. So we are suffering from the same economic decline because the entire continent is over-regulated, overtaxed, the welfare state is far too big. We've got a massive problem with immigration, huge levels of immigration. We've got a problem with the eco nutters, and we've also got a problem with Islamism. And all of those factors are part of a takeover, essentially, of institutions. And we were talking earlier about failed post-World War institutions, and the EU is the ultimate failing institution that is not democratic, and it reflects the elite opinions. I talked earlier about wokery, about the sort of anti-Western civilization attitudes that are embedded into all our institutions. That is the problem we have. It's particularly true in Western Europe. I think Eastern Europe is performing better economically. It doesn't have so many of the cultural and social problems, but certainly in Western Europe, that is what we have to fight. And I think in Britain we can fight that. I believe in 2029 there will be a political revolution in Britain. People are now not just fed up with the political parties in Britain, they're also fed up with the institutions of state itself. So the police are found to be complicit in this scandal of majority Pakistani grooming gangs, raping young girls. We've had, our financial institutions have been found severely wanting, creating huge levels of inflation, and our bureaucracy has been found wanting. So I think there will be an institutional revolution in Britain because that is what the public want. I think it's easier to deliver it in Britain because we're not part of the European Union. And ultimately, I think to get that kind of change in Europe, which I think is needed, it will require both France and Germany to see those types of political revolution. And I think that's where we're headed, because the public in our countries are now so fed up with what has happened. They're so fed up with the status quo, and an elite that supports things like mass migration, very expensive energy, declining living standards, certainly declining GDP per capita. I just don't think that is tenable in the longer term. So I think we're going to see massive political change. As for the situation in Ukraine, I did think that because we'd had very low oil prices recently, that would help bring Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table, because the Russian coffers would not be being filled up with oil and gas revenue. I'm pleased about what's happening in Iran, but one side effect of that is, of course, the oil price has now shot up again. So I fear that could prolong the hostilities. But I think, what we need to get to is we need to get to an end of this war. But Putin cannot be seen to have won from his aggression in Ukraine. That is very important from a European perspective, but it's also very important because of the message it sends to President Xi of China and the threat that could be to Taiwan.
John?
I think I'm going to focus mainly on the Russia-Europe relationship moving forward. I think relations between Russia and Europe are going to be poisonous and very dangerous for as far as the eye can see. I think the April 2008 decision to bring Ukraine into NATO and then doubling down on that at every point moving forward was a disastrous mistake. It led to the February 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine and the present war that's now confronting us. I do not believe there is a meaningful peace settlement to this war. I think that the Russians on one side and the Ukrainians in the West on the other side are so far apart on what terms are satisfactory for ending the conflict that it's not going to be ended peacefully. You're going to end up with a frozen conflict. And when you get that frozen conflict, the Russians are going to be seen to have been the winners. The end result is that the West and the Ukraine will go to great lengths to undermine Russia's position in the part of Ukraine that they annex. At the same time, the Russians will go to great lengths to make sure that Ukraine is a dysfunctional rump state and do everything they can to wreck the politics and economics of Ukraine. The West, of course, save for a few countries, will have terrible relations with the Russians and do everything possible to undermine Russia's position. So if you look at just Russia versus Ukraine and Russia versus the West, in the wake of a frozen conflict, it looks terrible. Superimposed on this frozen conflict are at least 5 big potential flashpoints that could lead to a hot war. 1 is the Arctic, 2 is the Baltic Sea, 3 is Kaliningrad, 4 is Belarus, 5 is Moldova, and there's a 6th one, the Black Sea. These are all locations in Eastern Europe where big trouble could start, and easily start because of the poisonous relations between Russia and Ukraine and between Russia and the United States. So I think moving forward, it's going to be a very difficult time for the Europeans and for the Russians, and certainly for the Ukrainians.
What is the Indian and Chinese perspective on this?
So
It's world politics.
I think in our case, we have both countries which have otherwise good relations with Russia. We basically want this war to stop. And I don't think to expect that one side will back down is very difficult. So I think, at least in the short run, the best thing we can expect is some sort of a ceasefire till tempers cool down. There's no point in blaming one way or the other, whether the push of NATO eastward or was it aggression from Russia. We can sort those out later. I think the first thing we've got to stop is actually the war going on. So I think some sort of a ceasefire will have to some point happen, and I think that is best we can expect in the short run.
On Europe, well, if you listen to the big boys and girls in Brussels or in the big capitals, you get the sense that they are pounding their chests to take over the mantle of the liberal international order, now that the US is kind of abandoning it. So we're not sure what to do. We're not sure whether we should tell them, come on, or to cheer them on. I think Europe should kind of make up its mind on what it wants to do. And you know, if you listen to the current US government, their narrative on the conflict in Ukraine is now almost identical to what China has been saying for 3 years, okay, to the words. It's amazing. But now, so I think Europe, it's a tough world out there. So maybe you don't change until you get mugged by reality. We'll see.
Glenn, you have now an easy position to finalize it.
I'm just looking at the clock, bleeding red, and thinking about how to wrap it up very quickly. But, well, I think I want to return to my earlier ironic analogy of base and superstructure. It's clear that in the relation between the US and Europe, that the US is going to demand a lot more of Europe in terms of its military spending and capacities, to be determined what that spending goes into and what the result of it is. That'll be a big theme of the NATO summit that's just coming up. But the bigger question, the $64,000 question plus several ensuing decades of inflation, is what is the mindset? What is the mind that is on top of that? What is the intellectual and strategic superstructure that would be on top of Europe? And there we see almost no sign whatsoever of a change in the elite mindset. It's pretty much attempting to be the continuation of the Biden administration at this point. There is not an intellectual plugging in to the strategic questions that face Europe. If you ask about what Europe's strategy is in a rapidly changing global order, and you get a different answer to that question in 2018, 2020, 2022, and 2024, it does not mean that very, very smart, intelligent, shrewd strategists were rapidly responding to events. It meant that there was no clear goal and no strategy, leading to a very reactive viewpoint throughout. European relationship to China, is it decoupling or is it coupling because Trump is against them? I mean, there's no answer to these questions, or at least no answer that can be taken seriously, because when they change that rapidly, it undercuts the credibility of the person saying so. All we can be certain of is that in this kind of global competition, a Europe that becomes more divided, whose publics don't have the opportunity to vote for certain parties that would actually represent them, will result not only in a more dangerous politics in Europe, but also a much more dangerous situation for the globe. Because if those sentiments become more extreme, if people become more dissatisfied, and if European elites are unable to change their direction, then the consequences are damaging not only for them, but for everyone else as well.
I think that we really see after this conversation that we are really towards a new geopolitical reality, as the title says. Thank you very much for this very interesting conversation, and I'm absolutely sure that within the next days the Budapest Global Dialogue will unwrap these topics more and more in detail, which I think is a very important task, and have very good conversations and have a very good conference in the next days. Thank you very much for your attention.